All right, y'all. Good morning. What a beautiful Lord's Day out there. Is it spring yet? Anybody tell? Okay. Y'all, special speaker today. You know him as Julian Metheny. I knew him before the Witness Protection Program. It's not his real name. Okay. The man went to the Memphis School of Preaching, Biblical Studies, Alabama Christian School of Religion at UAB, and then he's had a lot of hard knocks in his life, so that counts too. 14 years as a preacher. Some of y'all don't know that. The elders, for instance, probably don't know that. All right. He's had lots of jobs. Somehow, though, he was able to convince the beautiful, the stately, the saintly Judith Dodd Metheny to marry him. Now she goes by Judith Dodd Metheny. I think that's right. Okay. Please help me welcome a man who sold fish for a living among some of his many jobs. And some of you don't realize this, but he was responsible for the very popular bumper sticker, "Fear No Fish." In parenthesis, unless it's a really big one.
Go sit down,
Please help
Russ.
me welcome Julian Metheny.
Go sit down. You said enough.
All right.
Too much. Get that out of the way. If you have your Bibles, turn to John chapter 14. Please. To who, what, huh? No screen. No screen. That's high tech. That's not me. Hey, Donnie, turn that off and do something with it. I don't need it. I asked Brett, since he's been preaching through the book of John, if he was going to cover this topic, because as he's preached through the book of John, he's not covered everything in the book. There's a lot more to it. And he's doing a wonderful job. But he was not planning on this particular set of scriptures that I'm going to look at today. And so I chose this because I did not want to bring something that he had already taught on. But Rick Cawthon pretty much stole my thunder this morning in his lesson because it's along the same lines. But in John chapter 14, there's a question asked. You know, normally when anybody asked Jesus a question, he answered how? With a question. Sometimes. But here's a question that's asked to Jesus that really kind of set him back and made him wonder, have I really not taught this? Have I really not shown this? And you of all people ought to have seen this. But in John chapter 14 and verse 8, Philip says, "Lord, show us the Father." Well, let's go backwards just a little bit before we get into that. If you had one word to describe your father, who would it be? What would it be? Would it? Aaron, what would you say? The one word describes your father. Daddy? Steady, okay. AB? No, your earthly father. You may not be able to see it well, but here is a picture of my mother and father. And Aaron met my mother and father. I know AB did. Donnie did. AB, I'm going to ask you again. If you were to describe my father in one word, what would you say? What would you say? Singing is probably the word that I would use. When my father passed away, I took this and gave it to the director of the funeral home, and I said, I want you to put this in his hand, in his casket. But I do not want you to seal it up with him taking it to heaven with him. I want it back. Nothing was said. My two brothers and two sisters and their spouses were all there, and it was as quiet as a church house when I handed this to that funeral director. They didn't know I was going to do it. Afterwards, the funeral director he saw how quiet everybody was. He knew not to ask the stupid question. So later he came to me and he said, "What you gave me to put in your dad's hand, what is it?" He said, "I've been a funeral home director for 43 years, and I've had a lot of things put in people's hands or in the casket with them. Never one of these." How many of you know what that is? That's a chromatic pitch pipe. That tells you that a person carrying that has done what? Learned a little bit about music, but they lead singing. They lead singing. Well, it could be. Could be tone deaf, but he said they could be tone deaf. But if one word would... So they can have it right. And Donnie, if he loses his or doesn't bring it that day, he's struggling. But that right there in my life has described my father, if one thing can. And as we think of our father, we look back and we have in our mind's eye, you don't have to have... by the way, I want everybody raise your hand that has a picture with you of your mother and father. Erin does, on her phone. But how many of us carry around a picture of our mother and father? Not necessary, is it? You know where all the wrinkles are. You know where all the warts are. You know everything about them. It's embedded in your mind. I remember when my father's twin brother came back from World War II, was the only time that that my dad and his twin brother separated, because even during the war, they were together. But for 3 months, my uncle stayed in California and my dad came back to Arkansas to his bride. While my uncle was there, he got a privilege that not many people can say they've ever done. He was given the duty of driving for one day a very important person. And he had to go to a driving school to learn to stop the car properly, to make turns properly. The person was Helen Keller. She couldn't tell when he was about to put on the brakes. She couldn't tell if he was going to swerve around a corner. She didn't know how to brace herself. He had to learn to drive differently for her. Didn't have seat belts, but she couldn't see because she was blind. A few months ago, I saw on the internet where FDR had met Helen Keller. And you know what the picture showed her doing? She was touching his face. She wanted to see. She wanted to feel what he looked like. Today, we want to look at what Jesus says and showed us that God looked like. Now, we know I've got notes somewhere, but I've already thrown them out, and you've got them out. But we have throughout the recorded pages that Moses in Deuteronomy 33 could not see the face of God as he received the 10 Commandments. Do you remember what part of God he could see? He could only see the back. God would allow him to see the hinder parts, but not the face. Humans could not stand the glory. They couldn't physically be able to live after seeing the glory of God. But here we see where in John chapter 14, Jesus has met with his disciples in the upper room. They have gone through a difficult situation that Jesus put them in, where he washed their feet. He became the servant and washed their feet. Now, at the time, they didn't understand the lesson that was being taught. It was a couple of months later before the impact of it really hit them. They received the opportunity to have communion with Christ, the Last Supper. Why do we call it the Last Supper? It was the last meal that Christ had on earth. It was the Last Supper. We call it the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper. Jesus knew that it was going to be his last meal. Now, if you had the knowledge that today their next meal is going to be your last meal on earth, who would you want with you? Your family members? Your closest friends? Wouldn't it be a special occasion to you? It may be a sad occasion to them, but you'd want to make it a special occasion, wouldn't you? And that's what Jesus does. He becomes the servant and washes their feet. Jesus tells them that he's going to be leaving and going away. He is predicting his death. In John chapter 13, 31 through 38, he tells them that he's going to prepare a place for them. He's going to build mansions for them. But he also says that you know the way. And when he said that, that's what prompted the question by Philip. Lord, how do we know the way? We don't even know where you're going. You haven't told us where you're going. But in Matthew 16:21 he did, in Matthew 17:22 he did, and in Matthew 20:17 he did. And they did not understand. They didn't comprehend everything Jesus was teaching them. He knew they wouldn't comprehend it. He told them that they wouldn't. But later you will. When you receive all the fullness of the Spirit, and then you'll comprehend it all. In John chapter 14, 4 through 6, he says that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus took the three basic commandments that the Jewish religion is built upon, and he made a tremendous claim that in him all three found their fulfillment and their full expression. Now, he has summed up in this phrase the Jewish faith right there. I am. And if you remember the last lesson I spoke on, the great I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. He's making a statement here that all Jews looked forward to knowing about the truth. David prayed in Psalms 86 and verse 11 to teach me thy ways, and I will walk in thy truths. In Psalm 26:3, I have walked in thy truth. Psalm 119:30, I have chosen the way of truth. A man's character doesn't matter very much if he's teaching math or astronomy or some of the many languages of the world. But wouldn't you think that a man's character matters a lot if he is teaching you moral truths? I mean, if you went to a class about moral truths, You'd want to look up on Facebook about the professor and learn a little bit about him, wouldn't you? And if he was not living the moral life that he teaches about, you probably wouldn't want to attend the class, would you? Well, Jesus is teaching about moral truths right here, and they're questioning in their mind, how are you? I am the way, the truth, and the life. But Jesus, through his life, through his teachings to them, has told them that very thing. In Psalms 16 in verse 11, you will show me the path of life. Proverbs 6:23, and he is in the way of life that keepeth instruction. And then Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except by me. Now that might be an egotistical statement, but it might be a true statement. And everything that he has lived and shown them proves that to be a truthful statement. The Greeks, even of all ancient worlds, it may be the most staggering statement that Jesus ever spoke in John 14, 7 through 11, when he says this, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. The Greeks thought that God's characteristic was that of being invisible, that he was some mysterious thing up here that we could pray to or talk about or study about, but they weren't sure whether he really existed. And the Jews were right the opposite. The Jews built their fundamental faith on the fact that God did exist, and he was their personal God. He was their Father, and they were his children. And they took a personal pride in that fact. You didn't talk about their God. They'd fight you over it. But God walks in our daily lives. He walked in the daily lives as a carpenter. He knew the trials and troubles and problems that went through life. Of whatever occupation it was, he knew the problems that we faced. He knew the deadlines. He knew the financial crises that we might encounter. But he walked that life. God came and walked the face of this earth and dwelt among man. God saw the trials and tribulations that man faced every day. In Genesis 3:19, he says, in the sweat of thy face shall you eat bread. He knows the toil that it's going to be. God knows what it is to be tempted, as Jesus was tempted and fasted after fasting 40 days and 40 nights. God is not like a commander of an army who leads from the back and tells his men to go forward. God's the man up front, and his army is fighting behind him. In Jesus, we see the loving God. We see a caring God, a compassionate God. And do you remember before Jesus took the Lord's Supper and gave to his disciples, do you remember what he first told them right before he did this? He told them that one of you is going to betray me. But yet, did he withhold that last peaceful meal that he was to have? Did he withhold that from that person? He did not. There are religions, and many people teach that the first person given the fruit of the bread, or the fruit of the vine and the bread by Jesus was Judas. I don't know where they get that, but they think that. The text doesn't tell us as far as I can find it. But the text doesn't say that he excluded anyone either. Jesus included all people. His friends, his closest friend was probably John. Mary and Martha and Lazarus were right in there with it. But who would you say would have been his enemy in that room? The man who bargained yesterday for 30 pieces of silver. And Jesus knew about it. But he has seen the Father in the life of Jesus, in the love and in the compassion. Jesus is the revelation of God, and in that revelation leaves the mind of man. Jesus claims to be what he says he was. He claims to be the Son of God. Can you imagine what was going through Philip's mind at this time? He wanted to know, who is Jesus? He's still trying to figure that out. He thinks Jesus is going to be a king to sit on an earthly kingdom, and that all the nations of the world are going to bow down to them. And they're wanting to, just a few days earlier, they're arguing who's going to be the greatest man in his kingdom. Who's going to sit beside him on the throne? Who's going to be his advisors? They're looking for a different kingdom, even at this point. So Philip asked the question, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. What does Jesus say in verse 9? Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you for such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. I am the Father. All of a sudden, they've been waiting to see Jesus as the earthly king, and now he's telling them and opening up as through his teaching, he tells them a little bit more. And this is the last one. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And in me, you can see the Father. But as Jesus went on, let's see, in verse 12, I tell you the truth, anyone who has faith in me will do what I have been doing, and he will do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. Now, how would that go over? They've seen Jesus perform miracles. They've seen him raise the dead, heal the people from leprosy, from other diseases, make the lame to walk, the blind to see. He's cast out demons that they couldn't cast out. But he did it. And now he's telling them that they're going to do greater things. How did they do greater things? Well, let's think about this for a moment. When Jesus lived his adult life, now I know as an infant he went to Egypt, but as an adult life, he lived primarily in what we call Palestine today. He taught, and maybe had as many as probably 500 or fewer disciples, converts, when he physically walked the earth today. Stan, how many do you think would we call disciples of Christ today? Billions. His apostles went from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world, showing people the face of God, showing them who God was and who God is in their life. And they spread the gospel. In Acts 2, we see where 3,000 were baptized. They've already done more in their first preaching than Jesus did. Just a few chapters over, we see where 5,000 the number is multiplied to. And then the number doesn't go in numbers anymore. How does it refer to? Multitudes. They can't even count them. There's not enough fingers and toes anymore. Jesus stayed in Palestine. They went to the entire world. Philip went to an Ethiopian eunuch. A man by the name of Ananias taught another man on the way to Damascus. And that man ended up teaching Europe. He taught our fathers of the gospel of Christ to see the face of God. The church grew. Now, I say that to say this. What are you doing to spread the face of God, that others might can see God? Every day that you live, every breath that you take, we have that opportunity to show others the face of God. And we do it by our very actions, by our words, and by supporting good works as this congregation here. The gospel is being taught around the world. And many other congregations do the same thing that we are a part of showing others the face of God.